Thank you all so much for coming. Very warm welcome. I'm sure you all know that there are a lot of things coming up in the next few weeks. Deadlines, maybe for a few holidays, more likely vision. But another thing that's coming up in the next few weeks is Easter. I don't know what you guys think of when you go to watch Easter. Possibly nothing at all. But we are the Christian Union here at UCL, and we think that the original Easter story is actually the most important in human history. So I'm really pleased to introduce Charlie Screen. Charlie works with students at a church over in the city. Basically, you go to find the gherkin and look for the building that's about 1,000 years old. That's the relevance. And Charlie, before that, he's studying history at Oxford, and he's going to be looking at this Christian faith that Jesus rose from the dead, some of the evidence for that. And I think most people of all faiths or none would agree that that is one of the biggest claims there is. Charlie will speak for about 25 minutes. We'll then have a short break before a question time. We'll take questions from the floor, and we'll also, if you prefer, have questions in via text on the number that's all around here. And worth saying that we will be doing them straight away, so don't worry about that. We'll then have about a 10-minute Q&A. We will finish just before 5 to 2. So those of you who have 2 o'clock lectures, don't worry, so do I. We will finish on time. But if you can stay, we have this room and we have Charlie until 3 o'clock, and we'd love to have you stay and chat. That'd be great. That's enough for me. Charlie.
Applause, that is very bold before I get begun. Thank you for coming. The question I was given was, did Jesus rise from the dead, and what does the evidence say? And to introduce, I just want to recommend a book about the resurrection. Here it is from the UCL library. It's Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, which I think has some very helpful things to say about the resurrection. Richard Dawkins, I assume you've heard of, famous atheist and professor at the university where I studied. I think he understands the resurrection better than some Christians, even though he disagrees with it. The book is anti-Christian, I hope you know. From the introduction, he says lots of people have been brought up in some religion or other, are unhappy in it, and don't believe it. People who feel vague yearnings to leave their parents' religion and wish they could, but just don't realise that leaving is an option. Then he kind of leans forward across the lecture and says, if you are one of them, this book is for you. Which is nice of him. It's an anti-Christian book, but really, it is an anti-apathy book. It's an anti-fence-sitting book. It's aimed more at agnostics or kind of religious, half-hearted religious people than it is aimed at people like me who he calls died-in-the-world faithheads, which is really. And I think his aim in the book is really, really good. So if you don't believe in God, then you should leave the religion that you belong to. If you don't believe in the central truth claims of your religion, then it's pointless hanging around in church buildings. And I think he and the Apostle Paul have basically the same aim. So you've got a short section of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. They have to just pick it up. And I think they have the Apostle Paul and Richard Dawkins have very much the same aim in it. So if you look down at where it picks up at verse number 17 down the bottom. Paul says, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. No point being a Christian if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. There is certainly no forgiveness of sins, which is what Christianity is all about. Verse 18, then those also who've fallen asleep in Christ have perished. There is no future for dead people. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, no hope for the life to come. And then 19, if in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. See what he's saying, that if Jesus didn't rise, if there's no future after death, then the Christians in this room are the most pitiful people at UCL. And they are, just as Richard Dawkins says, wasting their time with delusions and throwing their lives away on make-believe. Richard Dawkins, the Apostle Paul, they agree. If you want a heading for that, if you like headings, if you want a heading for that, the first heading would be, today's topic is absolutely foundational. If Jesus rose from the dead, then I think you must be a Christian. That is a real event that there is good evidence for. Then I think you need to be a Christian. If he didn't, then it doesn't matter how much you like all the trappings, doesn't matter whether you like Christians or not, you shouldn't be a Christian. It is wish fulfillment and make-believe only. Okay, so first area of agreement, if you like. It's absolutely foundational. Second area of agreement between the Apostle Paul and Richard Dawkins is that the resurrection is a real event. And I'll just be clear what I'm saying, so I'm not being unfair to Richard Dawkins. What I mean there is it's not a special category of faith events. It's an event that either did or didn't happen in the real world. It's a normal kind of event. So Richard Dawkins gets very cross with a type of religious person who argues for non-overlapping magisterium of evidence. Let me just explain that if you've not heard of that. Sort of faith person who says, all right, you scientists have your kind of real world of evidence, but we Christians have our faith events, where things can be true without real evidence. And you should, it's basically a way of saying, please leave us alone, so we can go on being faithful and happy, and you can have your scientific world over that. Richard Dawkins won't have any evidence. He says this about the resurrection. Did Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead? An earlier resurrection. Did he himself come alive again 3 days after being crucified? There is an answer to every such question, whether or not we can discover it in practice. And it is a strictly scientific answer. The methods we should use to settle the matter here's where we get to most sarcastic, in the unlikely event that any relevant evidence ever became available, would be purely and entirely scientific methods. Do you see his point? So a resurrection is by its nature a real event. It either really happened or it really didn't happen. There either is a corpse or there isn't. You can't claim that this is some sort of non-evidence event. And Paul here and the other first Christians, they would wholeheartedly agree with that. So I want to just read a little bit from the end of one of the Gospels, where at the end of today we're going to give out a copy of one of the Gospel accounts and encourage you to take it away and read it. And particularly towards the end, you can see their account of what they saw after Jesus rose from the dead. I want to just give you a little bit of a very famous event at the end. So this is John's Gospel. I think we're going to give out Luke's Gospel. John's Gospel ends with this claim. Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. So it could be a longer book. If you have to read books to study, it'd be great for the people who write short books. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And he is intended, the author here, if you're going to take him seriously as an author, has intended to write down evidence that he can persuade you to believe in Jesus. And just the section immediately before that gives a good example. We meet a character called Thomas, who is one of Jesus' closest followers, and the fun in the story is that Thomas was not with his 10 friends on the day that they saw Jesus after he'd come back to life again. And so Thomas, I don't know where he's been, out gardening or something, or doing some work. He comes in to meet them, and they say, "We have seen the Lord alive!" And I wonder if you'd be surprised to hear your sort of rational skepticism on the lips of one of Jesus' disciples. And remember, he is a good friend of Jesus. He's known him well. He saw the death happen. He saw Jesus killed. And he's not going to be convinced easily. He says, unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe. Do you see? So no amount of substitution, no amount of somebody who looks a bit like Jesus, no amount of vision, no amount of kind of mind trick is going to work on Thomas. He wants to actually any medics here? He wants to insert his fingers into the wound where they stabbed Jesus after his death to check he was dead. Anything short of that, he is not going to believe. Now the evidence that convinced somebody like that is exactly the kind of evidence that Richard Dawkins is asking for, isn't it? Testable, provable, definite, real. There's nothing kind of faith mythical about this. Thomas is asking for real evidence. And well, Jesus leaves him hanging for 8 days, which I quite enjoy. You can imagine those conversations for 8 days, 10 disciples saying, we've seen him, he's alive. Thomas saying, you are nuts, you are completely mad. Don't know what has happened to you. And then 8 days later, Jesus appears to him, came in and stood among them. He said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands. Put out your hand, put it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. And Thomas gives the only possible response faced with that kind of overwhelming evidence. He says, my Lord and my God. Do you see what we're saying? So 2 points of agreement between Paul and Richard Dawkins, absolutely foundational and real events. But here's where they would disagree, here's where they diverge, is our third point, is that there is real evidence. Might be worth just for a second, and feel free to say this in the questions, what sort of evidence would you accept? I don't know if I assume, coming here with the title we've got today, you had to think about the kind of evidence you thought I might try and trot out, and I hope you also thought about the kind of evidence that might convince you, unless you are entirely closed-minded, and what sort of thing do you think would convince you? If you look at the list here, you can see the sort of evidence that Paul wants to provide, and if you look at the paragraph from verse number 3 down to verse number 11, and the word that keeps coming up is the word appeared. It's there in verse 5, he appeared to Cephas, that's the nickname of Peter, and then appeared to the 12, verse 6, appeared to more than 500, verse 7, appeared to James, last of all, verse 8, he appeared to me. And Paul agrees with Richard Dawkins, this is a real, objective, concrete, physical event, and the evidence he wants to present to you is witness evidence. That's the category he's predicting. It's a repetitive list. There's over 514 people in his list, a variety of different sorts of people. And that's what he wants to suggest as the evidence. And here is where, lots of Christians got a bit cross about this book. I think it's quite fun and quite useful. But where it was disappointing, I think, is that Richard Dawkins doesn't engage in much detail with the kind of evidence that the first Christians present as their strongest evidence. So there are 5 or 6 pages about the Bible as a whole, 5 or 6 pages about the New Testament documents that, if we're being frank, are not very well researched and are not answering the best case of the Christian presentation. There'd be stuff you could say, I'm very happy to take questions about that, but his book doesn't really do it. See, witness evidence is what we're suggesting. The people who were there, like Thomas, who were faced with the overwhelming evidence, we have their witness, we have their testimony of what they saw and what they felt. If he actually did stick his finger, did it go squelch or squish, of what they witnessed. I think that is the right category, and it fits certainly the type of literature they're writing. So when you compare the Gospels to other ancient literature, when you compare the sort of material I've given you here, the right category is witness-type historical evidence. They're not trying to write novels, they're not trying to write myths, and there are lots of myths in the ancient world. They're not trying to do that, they're not obeying those conventions. They're trying to present witness-type evidence. It doesn't mean they're not lying, it doesn't mean you have to believe them, but that's the category they're presenting. It also fits the type of event. So we're talking about an unrepeatable historical event. Again, if you wanted me to redo a resurrection today, you are going to be disappointed. I'm not prepared to let anybody stab me and kill me, kind of lay me out on the table here, and let any of the training medics try and bring me back to life. We're not going to say, for absolute scientific proof, cold fusion and test tube, it needs to be repeatable everywhere. And this event is not like that. It's a one-off event. God became a human being. He was killed. He defeated death and came back to life again. It's absolutely essential to the claim that it's unique, not normal. And so the normal sort of evidence will be historical witness evidence. And there was overwhelming evidence at the time, and you and I are late. That's how all historical events happen. And it was there, it happened, there was evidence at the time, we were late. And we're 2,000 years late for this event. And we weren't there, but in the same way you have access to the Battle of Hastings, which is what I mainly studied. I worked out pretty early on that if you focused, then your degree became easier. And so I focused there. Or any event from your country's history, you only have access through witness data, archaeological data, text data. And the resurrection is no different. It's a historical event with witness evidence. And I think it also fits the seriousness of the event. So witness evidence is what we use for major decisions about our country and our foreign policy. What happened in our past? How do we feel about each other because of what you did to me 1,000 years ago? What should we do about that? It's what we use to decide events in law courts. I don't know if you've ever had to be on a jury. With witness evidence, we hear the story, we decide, do we trust them? Do we believe it or not? And I had to decide whether to send a man to jail for manslaughter or me and 11 other people. And witness evidence, there was a little bit of blurry CCTV footage, but basically it was witness testimony. We made that very significant decision about an otherwise basically good man's life. Was he guilty of manslaughter or not? And when we look at the evidence, I'm just going to do a bit of skimming through some of it and then encourage you to ask questions. I think you have to take it seriously. I hope that's what you'll do as the outcome of this. So, Rich Dawkins doesn't talk a great deal about the New Testament documents. He does talk about hallucinations, suggests that maybe they hallucinated the things that they talked about. I think as you look down Paul's list of witnesses, you can see that doesn't make very good sense. So you look at how many people there are, and 500 people. You look at how often and in how many different circumstances these happen. You may know it's quite common. My mother would say this happened to her for someone who, once someone has died, you think you've seen them. And look down the street, they look to them, oh, is that? Oh, no, of course it isn't. But this happens repeatedly to varied sorts of people in different settings over a period of time, 40 days. And they're very physical, some of these accounts. Thomas, put your finger in my hand. Jesus barbecues fish at one point for his disciples. And those are things that hallucinations don't do. And Rich Dawkins also talks about cargo cults. I don't know if you know what he means by those. He talks about sort of Pacific Islands, that kind of thing, where you have a very remote tribe that suddenly comes into contact with modern technology and is entirely overawed by them. They develop these very bizarre beliefs about things like the Messiah King of America, who will arrive by cargo plane and bring the great end of the world cargo. It all gets very confused. He says things like, Rich Dawkins says, Christianity and other ancient religions that have spread worldwide presumably began as local cults like this. Except that, when you read the documents from the first century, both the Christian ones and the non-Christian ones about them, it doesn't fit that description at all. I think he's actually making the classic modern mistake, and maybe if you haven't studied history of some kind, you may be guilty of this mistake too. That the common mistake is to assume that ancient people were stupid people because they don't know how to work an iPhone, basically. Whereas actually, we're talking here about the death of a local man who they knew well, who was killed in public. And all they need to understand is what a dead body looks like. That's what they need to understand, life and death, and how to tell the difference. That's the only piece of technology they need to have available to them to work out if this really happened. They need to recognise their friend and work out if he was dead and if he is no longer dead. And there's nothing specifically modern about it. In fact, I suggest, unless you are a medic of some kind or similar study, you probably have less expertise in that area than they did. People that used to die at home far more frequently than they do now. People used to die at a much younger age. People used to die of all sorts of kind of agriculture, right, that sort of thing. Death was all around them. They knew what it looked like. They weren't as good as us at curing things, but they were just as good as evaluating life and death. And people in Greece, they were not predisposed to believe in resurrections because they were stupid. In fact, this chapter of the book is written because they have a massive cultural background problem with the whole idea. They think resurrections from the dead are stupid, disgusting, non-spiritual. Before Paul was in Corinth, he spoke on the Areopagus in Athens, that was his destination before, and he explained to the heart of Greek philosophy. It was a bit like it is today. The Americans rule the world, the English think they're the cleverest, a bit like that. The Romans ruled the world, the Greeks thought they were the cleverest. And in the heart of Greek thought, Paul was invited to give a talk about the resurrection. And he got a mocking, sneering reaction. And the ancient world wasn't gullible about this, wasn't predisposed to believe it. And Richard Dawkins says, he thinks the 19th century was the last time when it was possible for an educated man, slightly sexist, to admit to believing in miracles without embarrassment, because their rational minds know that it is absurd. I think that may be an accurate observation about the difference between the 19th century and now, but it ignores the fact that the first century was in lots of ways very like today. On this idea of bodies coming back to life, they thought it was ridiculous. And in that context, in the first century, Paul's argument and Paul's evidence won the day and convinced people. They weren't idiots. And the other straightforward difference with the cargo cults is that with the cargo cults, typically, you cannot get back to the original evidence. Who is it that first saw the great Messiah King from America? Well, we're not sure. Whereas you look at this list, and you can feel the challenge in it, can't you? First hand, with named people. Look at verse number 6. Here to more than 500 brothers at the same time, most of whom are still alive. Do you feel the challenge of that to these people in Corinth? You know who these people are. They're still alive. You can go and ask them. You can go and talk to them. These words were written in the mid-50s AD. So we are sort of, I don't know, 20 years, something like that, from the death of Jesus. Not, you may have been told, sort of hundreds of years after the events happened, after myths and things have grown up, people began writing it down. 20 years afterwards, within the lifetime of the witnesses who saw it, while those witnesses are still walking around talking about what they saw about it. And I love, above all, I love the three people who are highlighted in this list. So you have Cephas, verse 5, or Peter, he was Jesus' best friend. And you have James, verse 7, who was Jesus' brother. And you have Paul himself, verse 8, who you'll see, verse 9, calls himself unworthy because I persecuted the church of God. And so Jesus' worst enemy, if you like. So just, if you would join me in a thought experiment, imagine your best friend and your brother, if you have one, or sister, and your worst enemy. Can you imagine those three people for me? You look too nice to have worst enemies, but just kind of humour me. And then just think what it would take to persuade those three people simultaneously to worship you as God. In my experience, it's normally the brother one that is the biggest challenge on that list. And yet that's what happens with Jesus. These people weren't idiots. They knew he'd really been killed. And they weren't predisposed to believing in resurrections. And they end up treating Jesus as God, which in their culture, as in for instance, Muslim cultures today, was utterly blasphemous. The idea that your brother is God, and they react the way you would. I'll never believe it unless you show me it. I'll put my hand in. And when Jesus starts hinting that he's God, they pick up stones to stone him. They react the way that you'd expect them to, and yet those three people end up in this. And none of this was done hidden away in a corner. None of this happens in a far-off land for hundreds of years of mystery before it kind of appears politically later on. At one of Paul's trials, in front of a Roman judge and a Jewish king, Paul says, you know none of this was done in a corner. He appeals to it in his defense in a law court. These are public events. Jesus turned the world on its head. Christians have been annoying the authorities ever since then. And the whole world saw it. And I think I want to suggest more than that. I want to suggest there is a resurrection-shaped hole in world history. So this was being written in the mid-50s AD, and as the Christian message is spreading out from Palestine, by 64 AD, when you may know there was a fire in Rome, and the Emperor Nero got in a lot of trouble for playing his violin while Rome burned, allegedly, and by 64 AD in Rome, there are enough Christians in Rome, according to Tacitus, the Roman historian, that Nero can blame Christians for the fire of Rome. They're a convenient scapegoat population. Do you see what that gives us evidence of? The spread of Christianity from very tiny, humble beginnings in an astonishingly short amount of time. In a world without internet, a world without TV, without radio, and there are enough of them in Rome to blame a major political crisis on. This is spread all over the world, even though it begins with 11 terrified people after the death of their family. How do you explain that? I think that is a straightforward, normal historical question that if you're a sensible person, you want to try and answer. Jesus arguably has influenced the world more than any other figure. Who do you think he was? How do you explain that gap in the story that all the people who were actually there say, we saw him alive again, and that's why we do all these weird things? And just notice, and be very careful of a priori assumptions. Do you know what I mean by that? Be careful of coming in here already convinced that resurrections cannot happen, therefore no amount of evidence could persuade you that they did. I think there's no particular reason to assume that resurrections are impossible. Nobody's assuming this is normal. Nobody's claiming that, oh, it's resurrection, oh, never mind. They were utterly surprised. They said this only happened because he was God. I think to assume resurrections are impossible without evidence is to assume the thing we're supposed to examine. And then can I suggest it helps to look at this and from the point of view of God. I want to say two more things basically on the stop questions. From the point of view of God, there is no particular reason why he should try and prove himself to you. And we don't say, I refuse to submit to the Queen because, to be honest, she's never come and had tea in my house. How do I know she even really exists? That's all. If you think what God has done, according to the Christians who wrote this book, he came from heaven to become a man, take on human flesh, so as to be testable, provable, observable. He then was killed, and then rose from the dead, if it's true, and to establish his claims. There were some magicians a little while ago called Barry Jones and Scott McLeod on Scottish TV. They tried to recreate the miracles of Jesus. It was quite fun, and a blind person drew a picture and that sort of thing. And even with modern technology, they can create some of the effects. We all know it's a trick, and that's quite fun. But here's the test. If Barry and Scott would be willing to go through with this, they need to be publicly executed by any neutral third-party government of our choice, who can kill them in any way they want, and check that they are dead in any way that they want. Then they have to be put into a cave for 3 days without any access to medical treatment of any kind. And then at the end of that time, they have to reappear and convince everybody, not just that they've survived somehow, but they are God and Lord of life. I think there is something substantial. Another thing I want to say is I think this is really important. Because despite the balance of ages in this room being quite young, death is a real issue for all of us. And Paul and Richard Dawkins agree this is important, it's foundationally important whether it's true or not. Paul says if this isn't true, those who've fallen asleep in Christ will perish. The whole business of religion is better. But if it is true, you can reverse all the logical flows in that bottom paragraph. Sins forgiven, and a hope when you die, a life that never ends, a meaning for this life that goes beyond scrapping for what I'm going to do with the 20, 30, 40 years of my life. This is really important. Thank you for listening. Let's stop there. You're going to tell us what's happening with questions?
guys who please. So now we're going to have a time of questions. Just to reiterate, we will finish bang on 5 to 2 because we have lectures. So have a think. You can ask anything you want. It could be related to the talk, it could be something you want to say. We can think broader as well, something about Christianity, about God, about life. I'm well aware that in this kind of situation it is quite intimidating asking questions, which is why we have these phone numbers. So if you want to ask a question anonymously, please feel free to text it in, that will go straight to me. And just to reiterate, I will delete everything, all text, all numbers, after the talk, so don't need to worry about using your number or something. Before we go to questions, coming round are copies of this book. Some of them are green, some of them are yellow, they're exactly the same. And Charlie has given on a piece of paper one historical document about the resurrection. This is another one, except it covers the resurrection, the crucifixion, and a lot of Jesus' life. Basically, a guy called Luke, who was a doctor and a historian, took it upon himself to write an account of Jesus' life a couple of years after he died. And historians unanimously declared this as a reliable recount of ancient world history. These are free, take them away, we've got tons. So, and have a read. Also, if you turn on the inside, you have these little feedback forms. These are just purely optional, just to let us know how you found it. So, the bottom half, just fill them in if you'd like. We would really appreciate to know, we'd like to know what you think. And also, if you'd like to find out more, then there's some tick boxes here. So if you perhaps want to meet someone or you want to read through the book, then tick one of those boxes. Obviously, the names and the contact details are optional, but if you'd like to find out more, they would be helpful. Right. We're going to go to questions now, so Ben.
We will start with questions before we do text. Questions if you'd like to.
Two questions. I wanted to make 2 points, one on particular resurrection, point of question. The first is the entire presupposition of your talk is that you only believe these the person who saw Jesus' vision, or was that person who had the presupposition is that they believe, for example, James, for example, Peter, for example, Thomas, they believe that the resurrection actually happened, and that when they met Jesus, they believed that he had died. Now,
I absolutely agree, that was fine.
I mean, that was one of the basic presuppositions. But my question here is that Jesus himself said that he wouldn't die in fact alive. Because he said that, I mean, there are instances where he also said, I should die and raise again on the third day. But he also said that I shall show no sign except the son of Jonah. That's Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights and then so shall the son of man be on the earth. And the sign of Jonah was that Jonah survived and that he didn't. And so, is it not more probable that if somebody tries to execute, this is my question, if somebody tries to execute something and they take it down and they give them raw and aloes, which we don't know this sort of thing, so the way they come out 3 days later with wounds, is it not more probable in actual fact that they were resuscitated, that they weren't resurrected? And this change in the translation is perhaps simply because they didn't understand what resuscitation means. And the raising of the person who's seen dead, that could be, to a simple minded person or even the person today. Somebody looks like they're dead and they come back, one could describe it as coming back to life. So, is it not more probable in actual fact that he never died? And that the real miracle, the real reason it spread was because, it was such an extraordinary thing that he was put dead and that God saved us. The second question I have.
Shall I go first question?
Can we keep one question?
Okay. Well, we can, if there are no ones, we can come back. Thank you. I think there's 2 strands that I want to pick up. One is about how you understand historical texts. So that the first bit that kind of Jonah points about that really, isn't it? So I'd say read them. The best thing I think to do in response to that question is, why don't you get hold of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, James's letter, some of Paul's letters, Peter's letters, read them and see, do you think these people thought Jesus died and rose? That's your question, isn't it? And I think when you read texts, it's important to read them all together as one, each author in the context of everything he says. And you will indeed find Jesus saying that he will do the sign of Jonah, But you'll also find repeatedly, I am going to die. They're going to betray me and kill me. After 3 days I will rise again. You'll find him saying, I am going to be the Passover lamb. Passover lambs don't survive. You know how much about Jewish history. I'm going to be a sacrifice. Well, again and again and again, the death of Jesus is absolutely central to Jesus' teaching and to his followers' teaching about what he did. So I suggest that a thing like, I'm going to do what Jonah did, and the best thing there is to say, he's saying, I'm a bit like Jonah. What did Jonah do? If you don't know the story, didn't have to make a whale in Sunday school, then he was swallowed by a fish and returned 3 days later. And I suggest you've got it the wrong way around, as it were. So you're right, there is a metaphorical element and a literal element, and then you just put them the wrong way around. And say that the resuscitation, the life bit, is the thing they're saying is absolutely literal. He really died, he really rose. The metaphorical bit is a bit like Jonah, which everyone works. And on resuscitation as an idea, again, I think just read. Partly there's a word problem there, in that the word they're using is a word about coming back to life from the dead. It's the same word they use for what they believe would happen at the end of the world, when all of the dead would come out of their tombs and come back to life again. It's the same word. So there's not a kind of confusion there, I think, particularly when we're talking about somebody they think has died as a sacrifice of sins. Is resuscitation credible? Obviously, that's a good theory to evaluate. That's what I'm suggesting you do. Resurrection's shaped whole in world history. What do you think explains it? There is one good suggestion. Wasn't really dead, just kind of resuscitated. I'd suggest read what happened to him. So flogged, and then executed, and then checked he was dead, spear in the side. Yet those herbs may have some medicinal properties, but I doubt that when someone has lost loads of blood from being flogged, when they've been hung up hard to breathe, when they've expired, stopped breathing, when they've been stabbed in the side, wrapping them up with some herbs, I suggest, isn't going to do them a lot of good for 3 days. So we're saying which is the more plausible explanation of what happens. Nobody in the first century suggests that view. I think it's also important. So when we're trying to work our way back to historical events, you can see people saying Jesus never, the resurrection didn't happen. It's a fact. And the body is still somewhere. You can see that. The disciples stole the body, is the idea the Jewish authorities come up with to explain it. Nobody suggests resuscitation, and they didn't find that a credible alternative. But you may, and please do study it.
Okay, we had a few questions about text. Let's just take on the different text. So this person says, testable, provable, and observable. Tacitus is one of the greatest Roman authors of all time. He wrote about Eutychus rebellion in a fascinating way. Did he write about the resurrection? And did any other Roman or Greek writers write about it?
Thank you very much. Very good question. And so, as well as the texts of people who are convinced, the kind of witnesses for the, which you'd say, prosecution or defence, whichever way you want to go around, it's important also to hear the witnesses the other way, isn't it? And again, I'd suggest you look at them. I've got a few copies of a short geeky handout I wrote myself that lays out some of them where you can get hold of them. And what we have is the evidence we would expect if the story was true. So we are talking initially about a carpenter from Galilee and one of several Jewish troublemakers who is killed by the Roman authorities, who never conquered a kingdom, never commanded an army, and never wrote a book in his own name. So we have the ripple evidence of these events. So we have people like Tacitus talking about what Christians believe, and that they worship Christ as God, that sort of thing. You have the governor of Bithynia a few years later saying, what do I do about these Christians? They meet on the beginning of the week to celebrate Christ. We have this sort of bits and pieces that fit the story of the Gospels. That's exactly what we'd expect. We have Josephus in a couple of passages with some disputed whether he's being doctored by Christians or not. You have the early historians talking about the phenomenon of resurrection believing Christians as they spread out. And you have the things they say to try and disprove it. So Thallus saying maybe the darkness of the cross was just an eclipse. You have that sort of argument going on. You have the Jewish authorities saying maybe the disciples stole the body. So you have corroboration for what they're saying, the kind of corroboration we expect.
One more question again. I've had a really, okay, so we've had quite a few questions about Islam, about those things. There's a really interesting one. If Jesus died to overcome death, forgive our sins and into heaven, etc., then why are there still conditions of getting into heaven, like being a Christian? It seems like he only came for a set few people rather than.
Thank you. Very good question in 1 minute. And I think that misunderstands who Jesus thought he was. It's an excellent question. I think it misunderstands who Jesus thought he was. And so Jesus doesn't think he's an NGO. Jesus doesn't think he's a non-governmental organisation kind of distributing aid parcels. Our problem is death. He is the antidote. And Jesus thinks he is Lord and God. And the thing that Thomas says of him when faced with overwhelming evidence that he's come back to life. So Jesus doesn't just come to help us, save us, give us life, forgive us. Jesus comes to be Lord. And the way to access what he's offering is to submit to him as Lord. And I think actually that's one reason why our century is so different from the 19th century. Not just this sort of skepticism that Richard Dawkins points to, but an unwillingness to submit to lords. I wonder if that's true. It's a suspicion of people who say, I should be your boss. But Jesus is unashamed of that. It goes with any sort of belief in God. If God is a creator, a maker, he has rights over us, and he will forgive and adopt as his brother or sister. He will have in his family and promise eternal life to anybody who will have him as their Lord, but not to those who won't.
Thank you so much. Can we give another round of applause? Just say very quickly, thank you so much for coming. As I said, the Luke's Gospel, please take them away. And also, the feedback forms, there's going to be a box over there, someone with a box, just whack them in there. Remember, write your details if you would like some follow-up. Also, I've got some free books. If you would like to know more about sort of the general story of Christianity and how it all works, how it all fits together, this is a great book. We've got a pile of those to just give away. And also, if anyone wants to buy them, we've got free. We've got them. They're free. Just you ask. And yeah, Brian's telling me to put them. So the roses tin. Turn around. The roses tin. That's where the feedback comes from. We've got this room for another hour. So if you don't have lectures and would like to continue chatting, Charlie over here, some of the guys from Fish over here. Also, there's loads of free food. You can grab it. We don't want it. Thank you so much for coming and have a great afternoon.